educator. And Rebecca has distinguished herself in terms of accomplishments by actually changing institutions to become more appreciative of the Indigenous peoples and their history and the enormous amount they can contribute in the future. And one of those major accomplishments was as a teacher and working with other Indigenous educators in our city to begin the process of understanding with truth the need for reconciliation and the advantages of doing it. Her track record was noted by Paul Vogt at Red River College and Red River Community College, and she became really the change agent that contributed to a very appropriate indigenization of Red River College. She's also been very active in anti-racism and worked with Seven Oaks School Division and other organizations in contributing to the advancement of diversity, equity, and inclusion. She has held, until forming her own business, a high-ranking executive role in Inspire, which is a Indigenous organization operating out of Toronto, and she operated primarily virtually out of Winnipeg through Toronto for that national organization, which did an enormous amount of work and still does in relation to supporting primarily post-secondary education of Indigenous students from across the country. She recently formed Indigenous Strategy, and Indigenous Strategy is an alliance dedicated to the advancement of the resurgence of Indigenous people. In the normal way of talking about the kind of work she does, she's effectively a specialized management consultant in the emerging self-determining Indigenous economy. And she also is very, very effective in dealing with institutions, governments, and organizations that are serious about changing systemically in ways that would advance truth and reconciliation within and from their organizations. Her partners in this beginning consultancy include Ben Carr, who's Jim Carr's, the late Jim Carr's son, and was an amazing educator himself, including at one time principal of the Met School, which we're familiar with and work closely with through our satellite club particularly. And her other partner is Michelle Boivin, a wonderful event organizer that our club and Peace Days had the privilege of working with when several events were held by Mamaway, and she became the event organizer for Mamaway, and we became friends through that. So Rebecca has formed an amazing organization, which is a timely need, and she's exhibiting by example the emerging self-determining Indigenous economy by being part of it herself, and I congratulate her for that. And having introduced her in this fashion, I also say that the kind of leader that this woman is. In 1995, I paddled the Seine River from John Bruce Road to the Legislative Building with a fleet of 2 canoes, my wife and I being in one of them, my son, Jeff, and Denny Rocan, then the Speaker of the legislature, Manitoba legislature, paddling the other one. 25 years later, Rebecca and I were joking about my paddling the Seine. She had done it before, but never in the way that we did. In July of 2020, She womaned the bow of the canoe. I manned the stern. Brenda sat in the middle. Whenever there was conflicting directions, she would intervene and offer her opinions. And we made it in a 6-hour canoe trip from John Bruce Road right to Rebecca's house, which is on the Red River in Elmwood. And it was an amazing day. The leadership shown by Rebecca, whenever we encountered an obstacle like a beaver dam or a rock we stuck on or very low water, she would get out of the bow, pull the canoe out of the obstacles. We overcame every obstacle only because of her example and physical strength and determination. And it was a great memory. So Rebecca is a wonderful human being, a wonderful friend to have, and wonderful to have in our Rotary Club as a member. So Rebecca, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, David. I really, truly appreciate that introduction. Thank you. And I do have pictures of the three of us, Brenda, David, myself, canoeing. I don't know if I've shared those with you. I'm going to have to make sure I get those to you. It was a fantastic day. I think it took us about 5.5 hours, which is pretty good. So again, hello. I introduced myself earlier in Anishinaabe, which is the Ojibwe language. I am Anishinaabe. I also have Innu, which is Cree, and I previously recognized myself as Métis until I had acquired my treaty status through Bill C-31. I did want to share, so I hope I have the share option here. I did want to share a bit of a PowerPoint to give an overview of who I am and maybe talk about some of the things that are really important to me as an Indigenous woman living within these territories, Treaty 1 territory, Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, Turtle Island. We know there's multiple perspectives in terms of understanding who we are when we think about where we're positioned. So I'm just going to share my screen. So I think whoever set the meeting up would need to allow me to share.
You can go ahead.
Okay, great. Okay, there we go. Okay, so this is, I put my website in the chat for people to have a look at. Can you see this? I just want, yeah, okay, great.
Yes,
So
sure.
just giving you an overview of who we are as a team. David has mentioned that Michelle Boyven, Ben Carr, we also have Joanne Panera, who's a part of our team. And in terms of my work as an Indigenous person, I grew up in Winnipeg. I grew up in the inner city of Winnipeg, predominantly in the North End. I've gone to schools in the inner city as well. I graduated from Children of the Earth. I'd actually been going to Argyle School, but had dropped out shy of a couple of credits, but I just wanted to work. I wanted to work. I wanted to make money. I wanted to do things. I wanted to feel challenged and inspired. And unfortunately, I wasn't feeling a lot of that in my experience, my high school experience. So I ended up getting a job at Video 1001. I was a great worker, so they moved me up to a supervisor. I returned to Children of the Earth when it had opened, so I kind of gravitated back there, completed a couple of credits. Unfortunately, in 1991, I had lost one of my girlfriends, Glenda Morriso. She went missing and then was found later, 2 weeks later, murdered. And I think these types of experiences growing up in the inner city really propelled me to get involved in the grassroots community, participating in activities that allowed us to try and get a sense of what was happening and to more importantly have an outlet to express what was happening. So I did a lot of community work back in the day. I was a part of Red Roots Theater and Awasakan Theater. I did some of the early, with the early theater companies, we started producing plays that were addressing the issues in our community. issues of exploitation, suicide, racism. I don't know if you remember a play called Those Damn Squaws, but the play was to address the issue of Indigenous women experiencing exploitation, racism, and the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women within the inner city of Winnipeg. Because I'm not sure if you're aware, but Winnipeg is ground zero for missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. We experience here the highest number of women who go missing or who are murdered. And so when I look at my lived experience and I look at the context in which we're all living and sharing this space together on Treaty 1 territory, I often think about the promises that we've made to each other under those treaties to protect each other and to support each other as, as we're moving through life. So the idea of mutual benefit, mutual obligation has always been at the forefront in terms of understanding, the bridge building work that, that we're doing, to improve the lives, not only for Indigenous peoples, but for, everybody that lives and shares in this space together. So those are some of the things that have really helped me understand, what's important to me is just looking at my lived experience as an Indigenous woman. When I look at, my family, this is my family over here. This is my clan. This is my dad here, my son. This is my daughter, Serena, in the pink sweater. But these are my nieces. And so I have a home on the Red River. So my home is here on the Red. And it's symbolically, it's very important for me to share that, because when I think about our history, and when we think about reclaiming space and that sense of rootedness as Indigenous people, that's an important sense of my own identity. So the work that I do is really about trying to strengthen community and strengthen family and do those things that help us reconnect to who we are as Anishinaabe people in the best and healthiest way possible. And so when you think about those that have really impacted life, that happened after Tina Fontaine was found in the waterways, and that was the last straw that basically led to the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry. So this is Tina's mom here, and I've always been a part of like those grassroots initiatives that are really trying to bring voice to these issues. And there's a lot of women in our community here in Winnipeg and its surrounding community that are always, involved in the vigils, are, hosting potluck sings, who are, trying to spend time with each other to not only be there for each other as we're working through these crises, but to demonstrate that we're able to grow, strong, healthy communities again. And so I think for me, even though I've done all of this other work, that's kind of the most important work that I do that, people don't often see. It's just all of every time I looked at the river, I would think about missing and murdered Indigenous women, because those are the stories that we hear about these waterways. And so my daughter also had a hard time with the river. She was having some bad dreams. So, we turned to our culture to address the issue. We offered tobacco to the water. We sang songs by the river, and then we started canoeing. And so I'm happy that David and Brenda were part of that journey, but it was very intentional on my part to rebuild a healthy relationship with the river. And so we canoed every river and stream that drained into the Red. And I'm happy to say that, when I look at that river, I see life again, because when we think about water, water is that life. I don't necessarily see, those negative stories about the river, which I think are really important to me. So when you think about what makes Manitoba unique for me, yes, those issues are really important. And when we think about Manitoba, it's not just the MMIW. We have the highest child poverty rates in Canada. We have, the highest number of kids in care. 1/3 of our communities are fly-in, remote, isolated communities. There's 93 in Canada, and there's 23 in Manitoba, so we have 1/3. And so that really impacts on the lived experience that our people have within this province. 50 to 70% of the children in the Children's Hospital are Indigenous. I'm mentioning this because I'm on the board for the Children's Hospital Foundation in Manitoba. So 50% of the children are from the north. They come to the Children's Hospital. 70% of some of the units are up to are Indigenous, so cardiac, for example, and then 100% in other of the units. So dialysis, for example, the children that seek dialysis, 100% are Indigenous children. And we know that's related to diet. So when we think about the fact that 1/3 of our communities are remote, isolated, fly-in, and the cost of food up there, it's really important to contextualize that and to understand why, you know, a lot of the work that we do is important. And so when we think about the work that I'm doing, oftentimes it's about truth-telling, collaboration, reconciliation. And so when you think about, you know, these words that we're hearing out there, you know, resurgence and the work that needs to be done under the banner of truth and reconciliation, it's our responsibility to tell these truths, to illuminate them. But when we think about reconciliation, inclusion, and equity, you know, this is often associated like with decolonization work, or it's the work of non-Indigenous peoples to kind of get a sense of, well, what does that really mean? You know, what is my responsibility in that? And so I just wanted to touch on this a bit. I thought, you know, these concepts were really important because they're part of the work that I do. Some of the other work that I've done is in the area of anti-racism education. And so I built a policy for Seven Oaks School Division. I'm working with another school division to build a policy, another Winnipeg school division. And the province of Manitoba is also looking at the possibility of building an anti-racism policy. So they've tapped me on the shoulder to consider that. So when I built the policy in Seven Oaks School Division, my 6-year-old son was experiencing what I would call racism in the school system. And it's a very difficult thing to talk about. But when I think about my son, I wanted to share this. So my son brought his portfolio home when he was 6. He brought it home in November. And he says, "Mom, this is me when I was brown." And so turn the page. This is the image on the next page. And he says, "But Mom, this is me when I was white and I started turning brown." And so, you know, this was part of an ongoing situation that I had to I was dealing with the school, was just trying to help them understand, you know, like, I'm an Indigenous educator and I worked really hard to help my son, like, you know, many other children that I try to help in the school system, to feel really good about who they are as an Indigenous person. But whatever cumulative experience he was having, it was telling him that there was something wrong with the color of his skin. And so he really didn't like being in the color of his skin. And, you know, when I'd be reading books to him at night, he'd, you know, a couple times he'd stop me and say, "You know, I'd like to look like that, Mom," you know? And so I would say, "Look like what?" You know, "I'd like to have white skin." And so these were really important conversations for me to have with the school system and with his school. And I think it was divine intervention, because at the time I was actually approached by Seven Oaks School Division to develop their anti-racism policy. So that gave me the outlet to talk to all of these administrators in the school division to say, hey, you know, like, to talk about race and race relations and, you know, Indigenous inclusion and students and just the entire life experience that Indigenous people have within the province of Manitoba. And so again, some of the work that I do is very near and dear to my heart. And sometimes it's really important for us to approach this work dispassionately so we can get through and help people you know, move the needle along within whatever systems that they're working in. So one of the other things that I wanted to share with you was the conversation that I had with David Newman about the treaties and about some of the work that I do around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of the things that, you know, in our conversations was I heard David saying is that, diversity is a fact, inclusion is a decision, and equity is where the work really is. And so I kind of took that and started, applying that to a lot of the work that I was doing around, treaty education and understanding why race relations matter, or looking at things from multiple perspectives, whether it was a multicultural lens, a DEI lens, an anti-racism lens, a reconciliation lens. For me as an Indigenous person, when I think about truth and reconciliation or treaties or what we're trying to reconcile, it's always important for us to go back to the Canadian Indian treaties, because for me, diversity and equity and inclusion is not new. The DEI work is what the treaties were all about. We knew that, our landscape was changing in terms of its diversity. Everything that we did as Indigenous peoples or First Nations was about inclusion, about making room for somebody else to come into the circle and to participate. And so when we think about equity were the promises of the treaty. And so you'll often hear, concepts of mutual obligation, mutual benefit. That's, to me, speaks volumes about equity. And so at the end of the day, I think these conversations that we have are really important. Illuminating where we're situated, within our within Canada or Turtle Island is really important when we're trying to understand work around truth and reconciliation. And we have multiple frameworks to now look at these concepts. And so when you think about truth and reconciliation overall in terms of what's happening in Canada, there's really only been eight of the calls to action where there's been a significant amount of work. And so the Yellowhead Institute is basically, keeping a watch on the ways in which we're responding to the calls to action. And so when you think about it, like these are some of the areas where we're seeing response, but there's still a lot of work to do in terms of, living up and fulfilling those obligations that were outlined in the TRC calls to action. And I'm just going to end on this note here. So when we think about, how do we understand the work that we're doing, in terms of Indigenous relations and reconciliation, when we think about what was happening if we look at it from the lens of the education system, multiculturalism in Canada was officially adopted by the government in the 1970s and 80s, and it was a response from the education system to address these changing demographics. So at that time, the federal government, was enhancing immigration at that time, and in the 2000s, we've seen a lot of work around multiculturalism in Canada, and therefore new initiatives within the education system to support, the integration of newcomers into our territories. And so people started advocating for more, because multiculturalism was just the tip of the iceberg. People wanted to feel, something more meaningful in terms of diversity and inclusion. But when you think about diversity and inclusion, that's where, Indigenous Aboriginal education had emerged, because at one time there was an attempt to put Aboriginal peoples under this multicultural education framework, and Indigenous people fought for their distinct rights. And so that's where we see Aboriginal education also emerging in the early 80s as a distinct area of study. We also see cultural competency that was emerging, social justice education, and then human rights. So when we think about how we've moved things forward, we've moved from this multicultural framework to diversity, equity, inclusion, and now we've arrived at anti-racism education. We've also got this umbrella of truth and reconciliation, which is really about truth, justice, and equity. And so there's all of these spaces that there's some common ground within all of these spaces. And at the end of the day, I think everybody wants to feel that they have an equal opportunity at, in the spaces within where we live and work. And so, so this is some of the work that I do. And I try to break it down from an Indigenous lens. I show the limitations of each of these frameworks. When we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, for example, we've kind of defaulted to gender equity, and we now need to move beyond that. And so now we're looking at it from a race relations lens, which is really important. And so that's why I'm happy that we're now seeing more anti-racism work within the education system, because it really allows us to hold people accountable to the pledges that they're making, within their policies or their strategic plans. And for me, the strength of anti-racism is in the data and the accountability measures that are put in place to see if we're actually moving the needle. And so that's where I think anti-racism picks up where Aboriginal education left off in some ways, it's just around accountability measures. So I'm just going to leave it at that. I would be happy to, talk a bit more about some of these concepts. I know that it was just a quick snapshot of some of that, but very important conversations to have and to break each of those frameworks down and have some fuller discussions about them. And I'd be happy to share some of that with you in more detail at a later time. But yeah, so thank you so much for inviting me. I know that the work that you're doing is really important. I appreciate the updates that I get from David and Brenda and through other conversations. So yeah, so I'm happy to be a
Rebecca,
Rotarian.
Yeah, thank you so much for a very clear, succinct, and challenging presentation. I open it up to discussion. Rarely do we have somebody who is so wise and experienced in this area. So we have so many people in our club that are committed to truth and reconciliation. So I open it up to comments and questions.